Ladies and gentlemen, let's Gaming Silicon video. We're going to be talking about the GTX 1070's performance as well as various cards in the Polaris lineup and how they also managed to perform, at least according to these leaks. Now we're going to do things very much reverse from normal. If you're a regular viewer, you know typically we talk about news items, or at least I do, in alphabetical order. This time we're not going to do that. We're going to get Nvidia stuff out of the way first because their articles are a lot shorter, therefore it's going to be a lot quicker to go through, and therefore if once again you're just looking for Nvidia stuff, then you can just stop watching the video, and if you want to listen to all of it, or you're an AMD fan, you won't have so long to wait as if it was the vice versa. Anyway, so with the 1070, there are a couple of questions which everyone wants to know. First, how does it compare against the 1080? Second, how does it compare against the previous generation? And thirdly, how does it overclock? Well, fortunately, in terms of 1070 to 1080, there's around a 24% difference in performance, according to Firestrike, which is not too shabby. The 1070 also manages to very slightly edge out the Titan X and the 980 Ti. If you've been following the GTX 1080 news for some time, you'll know there is one problem that seems to be affecting the boards, and that is maximum power limitation. Essentially, the GPU just can't draw enough power into it to keep the frequencies as high as you want, and basically, even if you were to modify the BIOS for higher power limitation, it wouldn't make a difference because you can only draw a certain amount with the modex connector that you have. And it would appear that the 1070 is very similar in that issue. Now, whether certain vendors are going to remedy that in the future, we don't know, and how much of a big deal it becomes as more cards go into the wild and maybe we see better quality silicon. Once again, your guess is as good as mine. With that said, supposedly the average overclock of the Founders Edition is over 2 GHz, which is still pretty darn impressive to say the least, and means that the card should very easily decimate the 980 Ti and the Titan X. And let's say that you've got a GTX 970 or similar card, it's a very compelling upgrade. Whether you're going to want to upgrade if you've got the GTX 980 or let's say a Fury, probably not. Yes, there is a difference in performance, of course, but whether it's enough to really justify that, or whether you'd be better just saving your pennies for either, let's say, the Vega 10 or the 1080 or above, well, that's for only you to decide. However, it is still a rather nice looking card, and it's very obvious, however, that Nvidia, did cut the performance just at that right level where it's not able to completely decimate the old generation, and it's not really able to be clocked high enough for the 1080 to keep up with it, especially if once again you factor in boost clocks and overclocking of the 1080, which means that Nvidia are not cutting into its margins. Moving over from Camp Green to Camp Red, further information has popped up that AMD's Editor Day is indeed taking place in Macau, which means that the Polaris announcement should indeed take place at Computex, which is about as surprising as me saying fire is bad if you're standing in it. Let's face it, at this point we've kind of known that there is going to be a press conference at June the 1st, because there's not exactly a whole bunch of dates for AMD to do this, unless they decided just to randomly host it online, in which case it doesn't have as much clout for investors and for the journalists and everyone else. It's better to fly people in when, well, they're expected to cover other stuff anyway. What does that mean? Well, let's talk about Polaris, shall we, and the performance of the card. So firstly, from what we understand, the 470 and the 480 series, so that includes the X's, so for example 480X, are going to be the full Polaris 10 lineup. So, just for clarification, 490 and above will not be Polaris 10. Polaris 10 will go up to 480X, and that's it. With all of that said, they're going to, once again according to rumours, launch within the next few weeks. So that's kind of cool. Obviously it does match up rather nicely with the timeline that we've expected for some time now. So what about the performance of the card? Well, basically we've got what you kind of expected. Essentially, the Polaris, I guess you could call it the 480X, or whatever it's going to end up being called. I guess it's going to be the 480X. And we've seen this in shipping manifests for some time now. It's known as 67DF:7C7, and once again, we've seen that in shipping manifests for some time. It's going to basically sit right around the same level as the Furies. Now, some folks might say to themselves, well, gee, that's not the same performance as the 1080 or the 1070, but there are a couple of points to bear in mind. The first is it really depends on how expensive AMD makes these cards. And secondly, we've known that AMD are not really planning to go the ultra high-end route for some time now. We've known that AMD are planning a mainstream GPU. Essentially, they've wanted to get virtual reality level performance down to mainstream costs. At the moment, you need something along the lines of a GTX 970, a 980, a 390, a 290X, something along that, to be able to really power VR headsets, which means that it's not really affordable to a lot of folks with the retail price of those cards. So if AMD are able to release the, let's say the 480X at a decent price point, then that's only a good thing, especially when you consider lower TDP. Now, the other question is, how close are these in terms of the final performance of the drivers? Because at the end of the day, drivers can make or break a GPU. So, while these leaks are around, if in a week's time AMD release a driver update and it gets more performance out of the silicon, like for example it could get another 10, 15, 20%, then obviously that's going to make quite a lot of difference in terms of the final performance. The next thing is we don't know whether the clocks are final yet. And in fact, we don't know whether the performance is final. Once again, these are leaks. And it is, unfortunately, only 3D Mark. 3D Mark is usually a fairly good indication of what the results are, let's say if you're playing The Witcher 3, comparing against another card. But as anyone who's reviewed GPUs or upgraded a GPU or compared your GPU against a friend's GPU will know, sometimes 3D Mark performance doesn't necessarily equate to what you necessarily expect. Plus, of course, the big thing is we don't know whether the Polaris is run on a different system. So, for example, if one is run on a 6700K and another is run on, let's say, a 2600K, then obviously that's going to have a difference in performance, even though it's going to be fairly negligible if you're just focusing on graphics scores. So that's just to bear in mind for both Nvidia and AMD's 3D Mark scores. But with all of that said, to be honest, I'm actually kind of okay with the performance of the Polaris 10. If it's, once again, at a competitive pricing, I think it's going to have a really good niche in the market. And when Vega is finally launched, which supposedly has been brought forward, supposedly it's going to be around October time, it should mean that AMD have a good coverage in the market. How Vega is going to work in terms of product positioning, that's kind of interesting. Because theoretically speaking, it could mean that we have this weird situation where we've got, let's say for sake of argument, the 490 and 490X as high bandwidth memory cards, and there is no Fury successor. So that would be kind of interesting. Or maybe AMD are going to release a couple of iterations of the GPU. Maybe there is going to be the Vega, which is going to be the next Fury, so let's just call it the Fury 2, for lack of a better word. And they'll also release the 490 and the 490X, which have more compute units, but don't have high bandwidth memory 2 support. Maybe they've got GDDR5X or something like that, with higher clock speeds. It's kind of interesting, right? Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.